Should we do whatever brings about the most pleasure or avoids the most pain for the most amount of people? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Now, recently we've been doing a bunch of meta-ethics on this playlist. Meta-ethics, we're looking at what is the nature and methodology of moral judgments. Now we're going to look at a few views on normative ethics. Normative ethics asks the question, how do we arrive at the principles for how we should live? So let me ask you this question. Let's say you are at a stoplight in the middle of the night and you look around and nobody's coming and there are no police anywhere in sight. There are no cameras, right? And you could totally get away with it. Do you run the red light? Now, some people, let me know in the comments, would you run that red light like in real life? Some people are totally like, let's follow the law. That's what the law says. We stick it out no matter what. That's the right thing to do. Other people are like, hey, it's the middle of the night, right? I would be a sucker for sitting there. And this is the main thing that they say. It's not like it hurts anyone, right? It's not hurting anybody if I go, right? It's only going to help. It's not going to hurt. That's the ultimate conclusion of what's going to happen. Those are the ultimate consequences of what's going to happen. Today, we're going to look at a view of normative ethics called classical utilitarianism. The classical utilitarians, the major ones being Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Henry Sedgwick. And classical utilitarianism is a mix of a few different views. So the first one is utilitarian, and that says that we should do whatever brings about the best for the most number of people, the best good for the most number of people, which is we could contrast that to egoism, which says whatever is best for me. The second view is hedonism. Hedonism says that the only true good is pleasure and the only true evil is pain. And those are the two things to look at. We want to maximize the good of pleasure and minimize the evil of pain. And finally, act consequentialism. So that is where we look at whether or not a thing is good based on the consequences of the act, like what is the outcome of the act. We could say that an act is morally right if and only if that act maximizes the good. Putting all those three things together, we get a formula that says something like this. An act is morally right if and only if it maximizes the corporate pleasures and minimizes the corporate pain. So when we consider our situation, let's say that following the law, we're going to sit there and there's going to be zero corporate pleasure, right? No one is going to be pleased for me to sit there because nobody's going to know, right? There's not going to be anybody around that's actually going to enjoy me following the law in this case. And there's just going to be like a pain. Let's say we'll quantify it and put it at a 2. I'll have a pain increment of 2 for just sitting there. Whereas if I break the law and go through the stop sign, again, or stoplight, nobody is going to get hurt, right? So there's going to be zero pain, but there will be a pleasure that I'm going to get from it. Let's say a pleasure of 3. So when I look at the corporate pleasure versus the corporate pleasure of me running the stoplight versus the corporate pain of me sitting there, it seems obvious what I should do. I should run the stoplight. Now, of course, that is wildly easy, right? There's no like contrasting pain and pleasure in there that we have to worry about, that we have to do any kind of calculating there. So that's going to make the decision super easy in this case. But you can imagine how things would get a lot more difficult if we had, let's say, somebody in the car that didn't want me to run the stoplight, that just started feeling, oh, I don't like it. And that would add, let's say, a modicum of pain, let's say a 1, right? And then me going through the stoplight would be like a 3 minus a 1. That would be a 2 in the pleasure. But then us sitting at the stoplight I would have a 2 pain and this person would have like a 2 pleasure. Maybe that would cancel each other out and we'd get a 0 overall. You see what I'm saying? Like you could come up with some kind of calculus here and get the ultimate result of every kind of decision that you could make. But that's actually one of the objections to this view, is that can we really sit there every single time and calculate what we're going to do? Can I really sit there and say, well, let's see, what is going to be first of all, I mean, I have a problem just saying that you can quantify how much pain and pleasure there's going to be in the first place. If for an excellent take on this, watch Brian Regan talk about when he had some stomach issue and he went to the hospital and they asked him to rate his pain on a scale of 1 to 10. That's hilarious. But the idea here is that you're supposed to, let's say that we could quantify it, right? Are we really going to be able to stop every single time and say, okay, there'll be a pleasure of 6 and a pain of 2, and then if I go, there'll be a pleasure. Oh, by the time you're done doing all that stuff, the light's going to turn green. So you should go just because the light's already turned green, right? It seems like most decisions that we're going to have to make will have to be made before we can even get the calculations going in the first place. I'm getting my calculator out of my pocket. If you're wondering what I'm doing there, that's what I'm doing. So it seems like this is totally impractical. So one response that the utilitarians have come up with is to say, okay, that's true. It's totally impractical to always be doing this. But in the history of mankind, we have got so much experience on what brings the most pleasure and what avoids the most pain that we've been able to come up with these rules of thumb. And these rules of thumb lead oftentimes to the most pleasure and avoidance of the most pain. So for the most part, you should follow the rules of thumb. And it's only when you get into, let's say, some kind of hard situation, some kind of difficult situation, that you should stop and you should make the kind of calculations that we're talking about. Only when you have the time, and only when these situations are important, and only when they're very difficult, that should you step back and you make these kind of calculations. So for the rule of thumb, an example of a rule of thumb would be like, don't steal. The general rule of thumb would be to not steal because it causes more pain than the pleasure that it brings. You might get a modicum of pleasure in the first time that you steal something, and yet like it makes a terrible amount of pain for the person who was stolen from, and it brings down the trust level in the society, and ultimately it just is bad for everybody overall. So you should not steal. So that's the rule of thumb that we're given. However, I said that when there are like big decisions, so like if there's a big decision, if you have to make, like, for example, we were deciding right before COVID hit, we had to make the decision we were going to move to Spain. And that was not a moral decision. That was a big decision though. And we had to sort of weigh pros and cons. And that's what you do, right? You say, how much pleasure will this bring us? And how much pain will it bring us to go? And then how much pleasure will it be to stay? And how much pain will it be to stay? And then you sort of weigh it out and you see which one is the best. That's what the hedonists will point to. They'll say, this is what you guys are already doing, right? That's just what we're saying, is if you should do this. Well, you should do this also, they would say, when there is some kind of conflict in moral rules of thumb. So when we have this rule of thumb, don't steal, that I just mentioned, there's also a rule of thumb, you should feed your family. So let's say you have this rule of thumb to feed your family, and your family is starving, and for some reason you can't feed them right now, and there is bread that's sitting there, and stealing would not, let's say, incredibly harm the person that you steal from. you might have to sit back and calculate, okay, what are the benefits of me stealing from this person? What are the pains that are going to, result from this, and vice versa. And that's when you would actually do this kind of calculation. Otherwise, it's all rule of thumb. In fact, one of the things that the classical utilitarians can point out is that if you are a person like our person that is going to stay at the stoplight and never break the law, then when you get into this situation where your family is starving and you're always going to follow the rule, don't steal, now you're stuck. Now you can have some really inhumane results because you have to always follow the law. And in this case, this could be a case where you should break the law. So probably a good response from the classical utilitarians about the utilitarian part of their three-pronged belief system, right? The utilitarian part being, let's maximize the good for everybody and do this kind of calculation stuff. They're probably like, they've avoided major disaster here with this kind of rule of thumb set. Another objection, though, might be a little more devastating, and that is that what is useful, calculating what is useful, could lead to some what we would normally take to be immoral actions. So, for example, and the most famous example given is, imagine that you are a sheriff in a town that is incredibly racist, and they believe that a black person has raped, and let's throw in killed, raped and murdered a woman, and it's like Wild West, let's say. So they want you to hang this man, and you see that these people are crazy. They're going to riot if you don't do it. But as the sheriff, let's just say, for a fact that there's no way it could have been this guy, and these people are just totally irrational. Now, if you hang this man, you'll be hanging somebody that is innocent. But if you don't hang this man, there will be a riot, and more people will probably die than just this one innocent man. More probably innocent people that are not involved in the riot, will die. So what should you do? According to classical utilitarianism, we're going to maximize the good for the most number of people. So we're going to look at one innocent person dying versus multiple innocent people dying. Okay, we're going to try to save the most innocent number of people, so we'll just hang this one person because, the most people are not going to survive that. And the objection goes that would be wrong, right? It would be an unjust thing to do. So utilitarianism is going to lead us to do some immoral, unjust things. Now, I can say that I've seen a lot of utilitarians arguing about this, and none that have really responded to this. I don't think there really is a response to this. If you're a utilitarian, then you should kill the guy, and that's going to save the most number of people. The way to avoid it is by saying, yeah, but like maybe in the future, if I don't kill this guy, then it'll save more lives because, people will see this riot and they'll decide that, rioting must be a bad thing. And then I'll save a whole bunch of lives because rioting will be outlawed or something. You know what I mean? Like they come up with these kind of like crazy reasons, but you can always change the scenario just slightly and say, let's say that this Western town is isolated so that no one would hear about the rioting. And you happen to know for a fact that it would be something that nobody hears about. So what would happen then? You know what I mean? Like you could always twist the scenario in such a case that in such a way that it would be beneficial. There would be more pleasure for the more people that would come out of doing something unjust. So, and it makes sense theoretically speaking that would be a possibility, right? So, so I think the objection stands. A second thing we need to look at is the hedonism portion of this view. Now, again, hedonism is the view that pleasure is what is good and pain is what is evil. Pleasure is identical to good, right? Pain is identical to evil. And one thing that they will argue is that the hedonism just makes things simple, right? You have an easy way to evaluate what is good and what is bad. Is it bringing pleasure? Awesome, it's a good thing. Is it bringing pain? No, it's a bad thing. An objection to this is it's not quite so simple as all that. So, for example, it's not the case that pain is just the absence of pleasure, right? It's not like the two are related in that way. So we're actually going to have some kind of calculus of pleasure and pain to evaluate what is the amount of pleasure and pain that every action brings about. So that's something that is not very simple. And a second thing is it's not so easy to quantify. And I can't remember where I've heard this, but the question that you can ask yourself to see this is to say, how much pleasure am I experiencing right now? Just ask yourself that question. Sit back and feel. It's not so easy, right? Like it's hard to even say, like, am I feeling pleasure right now? Like where is that pleasure? How much of it? Like, what is the number? Those are just not easy questions, right? So it's not so simple as all that. An objection to the hedonist principle is that it seems to equate all pleasures. And this is something that does seem to be a little bit difficult for it, because if that's the case, then, think about the different kinds of pleasures. You can have base pleasures versus higher pleasures. You can have the pleasures of eating Lucky Charms versus the pleasures of reading Shakespeare. You can have immoral pleasures versus moral pleasures. You can have the pleasures, let's say, I don't know if you have, I don't want to list any immoral pleasures. I want to avoid that. But let's say you enjoy torturing people, and then that's what, you know what I mean? Like that is an immoral pleasure, but it would be identical to the pleasure that you would have from the eating the Lucky Charms. It would just be like, how much pleasure, right? But isn't it the case that we should say, like, one pleasure is something you should do and one pleasure is something you shouldn't do? Well, John Stuart Mill tried to avoid this by talking about different qualities of pleasure. Some pleasure is higher pleasure than other pleasure. And so when you talk about something like reading Shakespeare, right, that is a higher pleasure than some of your baser pleasures, like eating Lucky Charms. Nothing wrong with eating Lucky Charms. I used to eat Fruity Pebbles. That was my cereal. I love that stuff, man. I don't like it anymore. Nowadays, it's just like, wow, I can't believe you still eat this stuff. But it used to be my stuff, man. I don't know. One objection given to this view is that it's incoherent, that it doesn't make any sense to say that there is this kind of a qualitative difference. A second objection is that once you make this evaluation of this pleasure is better than that pleasure, now you've stepped outside of the realm of hedonism. You're talking about a different type of evaluation, right? One thing is good versus another thing that is not as good. What is the evaluation that what is the standard by which you are evaluating that? Whatever that standard is no longer hedonic. So there's a second objection. A third objection, even if like we were to grant these qualities of pleasures, it's still the case that not all pleasures are valuable. So even if there are some, higher and some lower pleasures, there's going to be some pleasures that are just always wrong. For example, torturing people. If you get pleasure out of torturing people, that's just going to be a wrong thing to do, no matter what. And a fourth objection is that it seems like there are some things that are valuable that don't give us pleasure, or some things that are valuable even if they give us less pleasure. So, for example, the love that you have for your spouse, even when things become less pleasurable. Like, let's say your wife develops cancer, and she's no longer as fun to hang out with, and you have to go through that with her. That is your love seems to be just as valuable, if not more so, before she was pleasure. It was more pleasurable to be with her. Now it's not more pleasurable to be with her, but it seems like you have the same amount of value, if not more. Or you may argue that what's valuable is being real over being imaginary, whether or not it's pleasurable. So the famous thought experiment here is Robert Nozick's experience machine. Let's say that you were hooked up to a machine that would just crank in whatever pleasurable experiences that you wanted. And it would be so realistic that you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the real world and that experience world. Would you want to be hooked up to this machine? Most people would say no, right? They would want to live in the real world, even if they're not getting more pleasure from the experience machine that they could be getting. I'd be interested to see nowadays if people have changed their minds somewhat, because we live so much online. I don't know. I think that still a significant amount of people would be creeped out about it, but back when he gave it, most of the people would say no. So the idea here then would be that even if you could get more pleasure, the fact that it was a real thing, that would be more important. If you really want it, dude, read, I'm going to do a video on this. Read We Can Remember It For You Wholesale by Philip K. Dick. That is a phenomenal book. That will be like excellent. I'll give you the question about this. Is it more important to have actually experienced something, or to remember it, to get the pleasure of it? One possible response to this objection is that hedonists are talking about propositional pleasure, not experiential pleasure. So propositional pleasure is the type of pleasure they say, this is how they argue, is the type of pleasure that comes about when the state of affairs actually obtains, the state of affairs that fulfills the pleasure. So that let's say the state of affairs that we're talking about that brings pleasure in the real world would be me going to Mars, and like that's something that I really want to do, let's say, and I could either go into the experience machine and go to Mars, or I could be in the real world and go to Mars. And it costs a lot more to go in the real world to Mars than to go in the experience machine to Mars. Is it worth it to go in the real world to Mars? Well, they would say propositional pleasure would be when the state of affairs that causes you the pleasure actually exists. So yeah, it would be like, because that's what we're talking about, the propositional experience, the propositional pleasure. The experiential pleasure is the same for both. I think that's a pretty ad hoc. So I don't really buy it, but yeah, I don't know. That's how they argue. I mean, don't get me wrong. I actually agree. I think that for me, I would rather do the real thing and not be in the experience machine. Like to me, I don't want to be deceived into thinking that I've done things that I haven't actually done. So that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying if it's all about the pleasure, then I don't think propositional pleasure is like something that I think that's just an ad hoc answer is what I'm saying. Another possible response you can pull here is to go from straight hedonism to preference utilitarianism, where what is good is no longer pleasure, but desire satisfaction or fulfillment of preferences. And what you desire is usually not just the experience, but the actual state of affairs to obtain. And if that's the case, then you're even though you feel the pleasure from going into the experience machine, your desires have not been fulfilled. So we could just drop hedonism and go to this preference utilitarianism instead. But don't get me wrong, this isn't going to solve all our problems here. In fact, I think this is only going to make things worse, because our preferences can be really awful. They can be based on things that are twisted and crazy or ill-informed or trivial. For example, you might have a preference for fentanyl because you think that it's going to make you feel good, but you are misinformed and don't realize it's going to kill you. Or you might have a preference for racist You might have racist preferences, ill-informed preferences, or you might have sadistic preferences because you were abused as a child. I don't know. You could have all kinds of crazy preferences. And we're talking here about what makes something the right choice, right? A morally good choice. That doesn't sound right. Our preferences are a terrible way to go about it. So I don't think this is going to solve anything. Anyway, that is classical utilitarianism. Please don't forget to support this project in my Patreon page, link in the description. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, share this video, and I will see you guys in the next video. Adios.